Hi there, everyone. Today I want to tell you about this great book that I finished reading called The Cult of Alien Gods, H.P. Lovecraft and Extraterrestrial Pop Culture by Jason Colavito. This book is from 2005 and it's actually Colavito's first book. Now, I'll put up some links to Colavito's websites and his Twitter because he's a really good writer. This book is very, very entertaining and informative, so I think you'll really enjoy it if you're into Lovecraft, but also into the ancient astronaut theory and alternative archaeology ideas and how they have become popular in some quarters. So, Colavito's a skeptic, as am I, as was Lovecraft. But Lovecraft's ideas ironically became very much an influence in ancient astronaut and pseudoscientific archaeology. In the 20th and 21st centuries, okay? And Colavito goes into the whole history and the social backdrop of that to explain how that happened and how it's still going on today. He talks about, the first part is the Prelude, the crossroads of fact and fiction, and the history of horror, the horror genre, and sci-fi. And then ultimately how, Lovecraft would kind of fuse horror and sci-fi together into a coherent blend. And it wasn't initially that popular, but it would become more popular with certain scientific advancements, and certainly after the World Wars. Lovecraft did live to see World War One, but he died before World War Two. Now, many people would view science with some sort of dismay, because initially the attitude in the West was that science would fix everything, and that a new golden age would arise in which there was progress and wealth and knowledge for everyone. Okay, now the world wars sort of put a dent in that, and many people started to distrust authority and the scientific establishment, and they kind of wanted to revert to something like the Romantic period, which was a counter to the Enlightenment. Okay, Colavito makes the point that we're seeing a lot of pseudoscience arise today. So, in 2022, you can see that a lot if you watch the news, and just if you're looking at social media or YouTube, you see that there's a lot of demand for pseudoscientific ideas and a distrust towards science. So we are unfortunately in that sort of period right now, and eventually there will be another resurgence of rationality, but then that might be followed by another swing back towards irrationality and pseudoscience. Incidentally, the cyclical nature of this is reflected in Lovecraft himself. So he wrote books in which civilizations, great civilizations in the past, were wiped out, and the characters in his story are sort of learning about the details of those civilizations through archaeology and monuments and stuff like that. And of course, those tropes would influence alternative archaeology, ideas about Atlantis, and ancient astronauts. Science and pseudoscience in Lovecraft's time, and science fiction and horror before Lovecraft. Okay, there was science fiction before him. There was also something called Theosophy, which was something, a kind of a religion founded by Madame Helena Blavatsky. Or she was one of the co-founders. But she talked a lot about, in her book, The Secret Doctrine, about that there was a wisdom religion deep in the past, and that there were these cycles of history, and that there was hidden knowledge in the universe and different levels of existence. Okay, so Lovecraft kind of used those tropes and blended it with actual science from his day, and also with archaeology, okay, to sort of make this world, this kind of universe in which the alien gods like Cthulhu would live, or be sort of the backdrop, okay? But Lovecraft was himself actually a strong skeptic. He was a scientific materialist and an atheist. He didn't believe any Theosophy, but he did borrow from it to give his stories a sort of spiritualist bent. So horror as well. Very interesting discussion here by Colavito about the role of horror fiction and how it was sort of capturing an anxiety about science and maybe a hankering for another romantic age. And horror is comes in different guises. Like you can have body horror, you can have slasher horror, but you can also have cosmic horror, which is what Lovecraft was more about. So this idea that the universe is basically indifferent to us. It's a vast space in which the earth and its history is ultimately irrelevant, and the morality that humans develop and all of their social traditions and institutions ultimately don't matter. And Cthulhu and these other old gods, these extraterrestrials, they have influenced Earth's history, but not because they love us or hate us. It's just purely for their own self-interest, and we are completely irrelevant to them ultimately. So that's sort of the real horror for Lovecraft. Now, Lovecraft was, he came from a wealthy family, but the wealth of the family was lost. I forget what happened, but they lost their wealth. They had to move to a smaller house, and this deeply influenced him. So it kind of set in his mind this idea that nothing is guaranteed and that everything is going to collapse eventually, but then maybe be regenerated in the future. So it's like a historical cycle. The other thing is that he moved to New York City for a while. He didn't like it at all. He found it very difficult to get money in New York City, and he resented the presence of so many foreigners. So he felt like he was a foreigner in his own land because there was a lot of migrant labor, and he felt like he was the one who was getting the short end of the stick. So again, that sort of influenced him and his racism. He was famously very racist, although to be fair to him, he moderated his racism later in life, became a socialist of sorts, and he also did not hate people in the concrete. He hated them in the abstract. So categories of people he hated more than individual people. He could get along with individual people of different races, but he didn't like them in terms of the abstract group that they belonged to. Some of the racism did, seep into the stories. So you sometimes hear about, I think it was in Call of Cthulhu. I remember reading that, and I think that was where I first came across his racist characterizations of some people. Like he would write about barbaric Eskimo cults and also degenerated mulattoes and Negroes, stuff like that. Kind of shocking to read, at first, but then you remember that the time period was pretty racist, but I think he was still more racist than average. Okay, so certainly that was not good. Now, so he was writing his stories. He was drawing inspiration from his own life. At one point, he wanted to commit suicide, I think after his mother died. But he kind of kept going. He met other writers and he kept on writing stories. And these became very influential. He formed what was called what became known as the Lovecraft Circle. This was a group of writers, a few dozen writers, who would sort of trade ideas and use each other's alien gods and things like that. And so building up like a vast universe of characters and aliens, basically. And he would also write as a ghostwriter for many other people. So famously, he did that for Houdini, the famous magician and skeptic and exposer of spiritualist frauds. But interestingly, Houdini wanted to have his name on the title of a ghost story, and he commissioned Lovecraft for that. And Lovecraft infused some of the old one's gods into that story. Okay, so there was all that stuff going on. The Lovecraft Circle was expanding. They were putting out stories. Some of the members of the Lovecraft Circle would then later on continue to promote Lovecraft and also keep expanding the mythos and the universe. sometimes in ways that would have been palatable to Lovecraft and sometimes in ways that were not. But in any case, they did continue promoting the stories. Became more popular after his death in the US than during his life. But it was really in France that was like the tipping point. So after World War II, a lot of the American soldiers who were acting as the occupation forces in liberated France, they were getting sent reading material by the US Army. They had a special sort of service for their troops, so they could receive reading material to keep them, their minds occupied. And some of that material included science fiction stories, and some of that included Lovecraft. So American soldiers were reading that stuff, and some people in France, the French people, were also picking that up. They were influenced by American culture. They'd seen that the US had helped liberate, or they did liberate France from the Nazis. And so America was very much in vogue among the French. And also there was a kind of counterculture going on in France at the time. So young people especially were trying to throw off the shackles of tradition, and they were kind of rebelling against their parents and against established authority. And so some of this backdrop, the social backdrop, meant that people in France were very receptive to Lovecraft in many respects, because Lovecraft, his stories were talking about how there were dangers to science, and you'd seen the destruction in World War II with different kinds of weapons produced thanks to scientific advances. And also there was a kind of rejection of traditional morality in Lovecraft as well, because he was saying that human morality is basically just a conceit and that the universe doesn't care about that. So there was a certain resonance there with audiences in France. There was also a kind of romantic yearning which influenced some people to be receptive to Lovecraft's stories. So the Enlightenment versus the Romantic period. You've got periods in the West where you've got the ascendance of rationalism, and then there's a reaction against that. So, the Romantics, and then maybe back again to rationalism. So it's a cyclical process, and Colavito is talking about the current social backdrop, which is that there's a lot of pseudoscience going on right now, being promoted on social media and in books and TV, and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so we're seeing like a swing back towards pseudoscience, a yearning for a kind of romantic past, and we're sort of rejecting science and scientific institutions. But probably in the future there will be another reversion back to rationalism. So it's kind of a cycle, and that is repeated in Lovecraft himself, in his stories of like collapsing civilizations and then the resurgence of them. So I just find that all very fascinating. Then there was the UFO craze. Okay, so 1947, Kenneth Arnold is flying over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. He sees, I think it was 9 sort of boomerang-shaped craft. This is what he reported. Sort of skipping as if they were dinner plates on water. Okay, that got misquoted as being Kenneth Arnold saw flying saucers, but the name flying saucers stuck, and then people everywhere were seeing flying saucers. Okay, now the idea of flying saucers initially was not necessarily tied to extraterrestrials, but it would become tied to ET, especially with the space race between the US and the USSR, and with humans going into space and sending probes into space. People became more willing to accept that maybe aliens were also coming to Earth. So that certainly helped as well. People kind of starting to form this, or certain people starting to form a kind of alternative religion to the traditional Abrahamic religions. Okay, so instead of having God, you have angels, you have extraterrestrials. Some of those extraterrestrials may help us build pyramids or other monuments, or give us knowledge about agriculture. And in some stories you have of the ancient astronaut people, the proponents, you have the aliens actually being the ones who engineered or created humanity. So it's a substitute god. But anyway, returning to France, these ideas became quite popular in France, especially with Jacques Bergier and Louis Pauls and their book The Morning of the Magicians, which basically use a lot of Lovecraftian ideas and try to present them as basically fact. Okay, even though they said we're just speculating, they were kind of presenting this stuff as not fiction like Lovecraft was doing, but actual stuff that happened in the past. And this would influence people like Erich von Daniken, who was a Swiss hotelier, and for him I think it was just basically a scam. He just wanted to get money, but he hit on the idea of tapping into this pseudoscientific stream, and then he wrote Chariots of the Gods in 1968. Okay, very famous book, saying that aliens intervened in human antiquity to, again, help us build pyramids, develop certain things, etc. Basically saying that humans are not smart enough to do these things on their own, especially ancient peoples, and that aliens had to have done this for us. There was other authors as well. Zecharia Sitchin, who was Russian-born. I think he's still alive. He might have died, I'm not sure. But he's written many books as well. Okay. And he was another major proponent of the ancient astronaut idea. There was also, so one of the chapters here in Colavito's book is called The Fork in the Road. So by the 1970s, or the middle of the 1970s, the ancient astronaut idea had sort of run out of steam a little bit, and there was an alternative stream going on within alternative archaeology, which said that actually they were not extraterrestrials, but Atlantean antediluvian civilizations. So, you know, the myth of Atlantis told by Plato, that's the only so-called evidence that there is for Atlantis. It's all pseudoscience, but people like Graham Hancock have spun this out into many books, a lot of money, and a lot of pseudoscience. And the idea there is that instead of extraterrestrials, it was actually these lost civilizations who got destroyed by various geological or natural disasters, but they'd been able to spread their knowledge to different cultures around the world, and that certain similarities among those cultures could only have come from a common source. This has been ripped to shreds by actual archaeology, reputable archaeology, and the works of these people have been refuted 1,000 times, but they still make the rounds because they do have this very evocative image that they tap into, which is that there is this sort of secret knowledge from the deep past, and that we're trying to recover it by looking at various texts or various monuments and artifacts from, you know, deep in the past. So it's a very evocative and emotional image that it presents. And again, it's a substitute religion. Instead of the aliens being the gods, you have the Atlanteans being the gods, or at least the progenitors of knowledge and civilization. Again, taps into Lovecraftian themes, maybe not directly, because these authors don't necessarily even have to have read Lovecraft in order to be influenced by him, because they were getting their ideas from other people who were influenced by Lovecraft. So there is a lineage of thought from Lovecraft to these authors, okay, even if they themselves did not directly read Lovecraft. Now, Lovecraft himself was influenced, I said, by sci-fi before him, and horror stories, okay. He kind of integrated those themes together to give a more coherent picture. And he also was tapping into Theosophy, which he did not believe in at all. So Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy. But again, he was a complete atheist and skeptic, and he took pains to tell people this. Many people even thought that the Necronomicon was an actual book that existed, because Lovecraft was so clever at sort of painting this universe and dropping little hints here and there in his stories, and then working with other authors to make references to the Necronomicon or other grimoire type books, that people actually wrote to Lovecraft demanding to know how they can get a copy of the Necronomicon. Of course, there have been some hoaxes since then, practical jokes and stuff like that, people producing their own Necronomicons, including Peter Lavender. But anyway, that's just shows again like how evocative the things in Lovecraft's literature could be, that they have that influence. Then there was something called the Sirius Mystery and the Orion Mystery. So that's tied up with Robert Temple and Robert Temple and some other guy called Bouval. Let me just check the name. I always forget his first name. I'm sorry. Yeah, Robert Bouval. Okay, so Bouval read Robert Temple's Sirius Mystery, and then he was influenced by that to write the Orion Mystery. So the Sirius Mystery by Temple was about the idea that amphibian-type extraterrestrials had visited Earth in the deep past, and they had imparted their knowledge to the Dogon tribe in Africa. Now, the Dogon, according to him, were able to recite knowledge that they could not have known unless they had been in contact with extraterrestrials. Later on, anthropologists completely destroyed this. They went to the community, the Dogon community. They talked to the people that Temple had talked to, and basically they found that Temple had influenced these people to, I think they were being paid as well, the informants, to just regurgitate Temple's ideas back to him. So Temple was probably not doing this consciously or deliberately, but he was influencing the people in the community to just, repeat back to him what he was telling them. And so it was very sloppy on his part, and the anthropologists found no evidence that the Dogon actually had any special knowledge about Sirius. But anyway, a very evocative story came out of that. It's still making the rounds to this day. You see people on social media and that sort of stuff still making references to Sirius as like this place where knowledge came from, and those sorts of tropes. The Orion Mystery, okay, by Bouval, he talked about the placement of the pyramids to supposedly mirror the Orion star system or constellation, and I think he made some references to the Sphinx, and yeah, it was just, again, the problem with these sorts of tropes and these sorts of stories is that they use circular logic, and Colavito goes into many examples of circular logic. That's when you assume your own conclusions and you try to interpret everything to conform to your conclusions. So you're always going to get the right answer, so-called, because you're interpreting everything to fit into your preconceptions. And that's what these authors do continuously. Zecharia Sitchin, with his ancient astronaut ideas, also does this a lot. And he's obsessed with Sumerian civilization. And he says that he is the only person who can correctly interpret Sumerian texts. And yet he's continuously confusing Sumerian for Akkadian or Aramaic for Hebrew. So you can't really trust anything that Sitchin says about any of this stuff. And yet he's got a very dedicated following. Not as big as von Daniken, but still very dedicated. Okay, so then there's more discussion of that sort of business about Sirius and Orion, the problems in those stories. You have the resurgence of the Atlantean myths. So you get periods where ancient astronauts is more popular or the Atlantean myths are more popular. And that depends on the social backdrop to a large extent. So Colavito suggests that maybe the reason that ancient astronauts ideas become popular for a while is when there's a general crisis in the society, a kind of loss of faith in science and rationalism. And so people search for things beyond humanity, okay, answers beyond humanity. They can't let go of science because it's so integral to everyday life. And so they try to find something that fits into that general paradigm, which is extraterrestrials using technological flying saucers or UFOs. And so then you get like the prevalence of the ancient astronauts ideas. Alternatively, when the US is making progress in something, or like when it's like, you know, after the Cold War, you got a lot of I guess like the US ascendancy in the world encourages people to think about a past version of the US, which might be Atlantis, okay, a sort of large civilization, very technologically advanced, and there's still this sort of confusion in society because like the 1990s was a time when there was a lot of exuberance about the free market and how liberal democracy was going to take over the world, the end of history and stuff like that, right? But there was still a pseudoscientific urge, okay, a romantic urge, and that was found in stories about Atlantis and antediluvian civilizations more than aliens, even though aliens would later on make another comeback in the 1990s and into the 2000s. But neither of these streams ever completely disappears. They're always at least, you know, bubbling under the surface, and they're ready to spring back. So sometimes you get the ancient astronauts being more prevalent. Sometimes you get the antediluvian / Atlantean stories being more prevalent. What else? Talks about Graham Hancock. Okay, he has got that series on Netflix now called Ancient Apocalypse. Hancock has been making a lot of documentaries for a long time and writing a lot of books. And again, they've been ripped to shreds by anthropologists and archaeologists. His style of investigation, he himself says that it doesn't follow any rules, okay? And it's basically just using intuition to divine what happened in the past, because we can't know everything that happened in the past. And according to researchers like him, and this goes back actually to Jacques Bergier and Louis Pauls, these people all claim that because we can't use the standards of science to investigate certain events in the human past, we have to use other means, other ways of knowing. And that's sort of the basis for these sorts of Atlantean stories. Now we come to stories about Nibiru and the Anunnaki. So using biblical passages to stand in for extraterrestrials. Interesting thing here is that there's a parallel with young Earth creationism, okay? So many people in the US, but some other countries as well, believe that the Earth is only 6,000 years old and that you have to interpret the Bible literally, okay? So there was a God, that Yahweh created the world in a few days. He created all the types of animals and plants and Adam and Eve, okay, and all the rest of that. And that the flood story, you know, there really was a global flood, etc., etc. What do the ancient astronaut theorists do? Basically the same thing, but with extraterrestrials. So they're saying that the stories in the Bible have to be interpreted literally, but instead of God, you have to interpret certain things like Ezekiel's, you know, the spinning wheels in Ezekiel as alien engines for a flying saucer and stuff like that. Or, you know, burning chariots are actually rocket engines. That the Elohim, you know, fallen angels are actually extraterrestrials descending from space to impregnate women and doing genetic experiments. So very strange overlap between different kinds of fundamentalisms, because this is really a religion. It's a stand-in religion which substitutes for the traditional god in the case of the ancient astronaut theorists. Obviously, the young Earth creationists believe in God, the traditional God. They take it too far, obviously, by rejecting evolution. But so do the ancient astronaut theorists to an extent. So they deny human evolution many times. Many of them, I should say, especially people like the Raelians. The Raelian cult is a group that still exists today. It was making the rounds in, when was it founded? I think in the 1970s by Mr. Virilhon, a French racing car driver and reporter. He had a contact experience, and sort of along the lines of Billy Meyer and George Adamski. And he was supposedly imparted with knowledge, and that he was tasked with the job of being like an ambassador for Earth and to bring the message of the extraterrestrials to humanity. And he set up this group, this cult. It's got a few thousand or tens of thousands of people, even though nobody really knows how many people it really has. It's apparently exaggerated, its membership numbers, but it's probably got a few tens of thousands of people worldwide. And they became very famous in the late 90s or early 2000s when they were making claims about cloning people, cloning human beings, okay? This obviously caused a big ethical debate, and Colavito notes the importance of this because the UFO group, the Raelians, was setting the timetable for the news cycle around discussions of cloning. So very, very significant that a group, spouting pseudoscience about space gods was the one kind of calling the shots in this debate, or at least setting the timetable. And in a way, that's sort of coming back full circle with Lovecraft, because Lovecraft did talk about that in his stories that, there were these people who were being taken into space, or their brains were being put into canisters, and they could consciously see the universe for thousands of years, and that they were basically immortal. Well, what do the Raelians want to do? They want to clone people and then transfer their consciousness to a clone. So, in other words, eternal life. You just clone yourself, transfer your consciousness, and then you can live forever. Just use different bodies each time. So yeah, those sorts of stories were already present in Lovecraft, so maybe another influence there. I probably missed out a lot of things here. He does end in the conclusion with a discussion about the dangers of these sorts of stories being uncritically regurgitated and used in pseudoscientific claims about ancient astronauts or antediluvian civilizations, and that a lot of college students, back in the 70s, who were actually asked in polls what they believed, something like a third of them, or even half of them, believed that aliens had influenced human history. So that's to do with the media and the lack of willingness among many educators to challenge head-on pseudoscience. So there has to be more of a challenge by academics and teachers to counteract pseudoscience. But the media is also very much at fault. They often favor sensationalism and pseudoscience because they know that it's going to profit them. So cable TV has been particularly notorious in that. But now we've got the internet as well, social media, which he doesn't really talk about here because that hadn't really taken off in 2005 to the extent that it has now. But we can see the influence of ancient astronauts and those sorts of tropes in social media. So you hear about these crazy claims all the time by many, many people. And then he talks about how the West is facing a kind of cultural and ethical crisis right now. Lack of confidence in institutions, including science, and that this is going to probably get worse for a while, although there will probably be a reversion back to rationalism and a more Enlightenment type view. Okay, but that we should expect like a back and forth over time between the more Enlightenment oriented view and the more romantic oriented view. So those are my thoughts on the book. I've given you just a brief summary. It's a very, very entertaining book, as I said. I think that you'll definitely love reading it. And just tell me what you think if you have read it. Oh, by the way, at the end, after the conclusion, I'll just briefly mention there is a little section here, an appendix, which is called a continuum of belief. So he talks about the different variants of these sorts of pseudoscientific beliefs. So you've got extraterrestrial genesis, which is the idea that aliens genetically engineered humanity to what they are now. Okay, so that basically the aliens are the gods, and they engineered humans to be humans. And some of the advocates of that, Zecharia Sitchin, Alan Alford, the Raelian Revolution, and Louis Pauls and Jacques Bergier. These are not the only people, but these are some of the notable people who have taken on that view. Then you've got ancient astronauts, which is the belief that ETs visited in the past and helped us do certain things, but they did not necessarily engineer us. Although there is some overlap. Of course, they could have engineered us and then come back later on to help us, build the pyramids or whatever. People who believe in that include Erich von Daniken, Robert Temple, David Hatcher Childress, Lawrence Gardner, and Robert Charroux. I should have mentioned Robert Charroux, by the way, another French person. So again, the French connection is very important here. Now that I think of it, there's another Frenchman I should mention, Jacques Vallée, who believes in not ancient astronauts exactly, but that there has been a kind of extra-dimensional intervention in human history in which these ultra-dimensional beings are masquerading as different images. So in medieval times they were fairies or angels or demons. These days they're aliens. But it's just a facade. So there is a little bit of overlap even there with Vallée. I don't want to make too much of the French connection specifically. I don't think there's anything specifically French about this, but it happens to be the case that France was the site for a lot of this amplification of these sorts of ideas. Lost civilization and hyperdiffusionism, the belief that an advanced civilization once existed and it bequeathed technology and ideology to ancient cultures we know today. So that does not involve extraterrestrials. Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, John Anthony West, Ignatius Donnelly. I should have mentioned him as well. So Donnelly was Illinois congressman back in the 19th century. I think he was an Illinois congressman, but he was definitely a congressman. He wrote this book about Atlantis and Lemuria. So he was one of the early alternative archaeology advocates. And, Hancock and others have drawn from him, if indirectly. James Churchward and Helena Blavatsky of Theosophy fame. Let me just mention something about Hancock, which I might not have mentioned. Hancock was in the early 1990s a brief advocate for ancient astronauts ideas, because he was influenced by a guy called Hoagland, who has been spouting nonsense about Mars for decades. The Viking landers, the Viking orbiters, so they had landers and orbiters in the 1970s. The orbiters took photos of Mars, and that's where the Martian face photo came from. It was just a geological formation, but Hoagland tried to spin that out as being a face that was carved into the stone by a civilization, and then he supposedly, unveiled pyramids on Mars, and then, tried to link that to the Egyptian pyramids and all this other crap. For a short time, Hancock was influenced by that and was at least making noises that it could be possible. But then he reverted back to the more traditional Atlantean, purely human tropes. Diffusionism, the belief that ancient civilizations were in contact with one another and shared cultural or technological secrets. Similar to hyperdiffusionism, this belief does not need a third party to bequeath civilizations. Okay, so that's a little bit different to the lost civilization idea. But in this one, you've got more connectivity between ancient civilizations, which there probably was to a greater or lesser extent, but not to the extent that these people think, according to actual archaeology. So some advocates of diffusionism include the mound builder myth makers and other 19th century scholars. The mound builder myth is something that Colavito has written a lot about, including a book. So I'll probably read that one sometime soon. Mainstream consensus. This is just mainstream archaeology. So the belief that most modern ancient civilizations developed on their own with only occasional contact with other ancient cultures who were not their direct neighbors. Okay, so again, not as much diffusion of ideas as in diffusionism, but there was still some contact going on. But that a lot of the things that we see in these cultures were largely independently developed. And that's the view of mainstream archaeology. And then scientific materialism is H.P. Lovecraft's idea. So very ironic that Lovecraft, this great horror science fiction author, had such a outsized effect on pseudoscience later on. He probably would have been horrified by that, if he'd lived to see that. But definitely his writings have had that strong effect that Colavito details in this book. But anyway, that's the book, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.